Welcome back to environmental sustainability. We've talked about evolution, we've talked about food webs and energy pyramids, and now we're going to move on to nutrient cycling. So as we talk about nutrients and some of the inorganic matter that is discussed in this course, you want to think back to how is that going to influence the genetics and the evolution, but also what part does that play in the energy pyramid and the food webs and food chains. So nutrient cycling or different nutrient cycles are going to be a major part of environmental science because we are going to have a major impact on them and we're going to influence them and we're going to change them because humans have that ability to use our brains and ultimately mess things up. So nutrients are cycled through our ecosystems in specific pathways, and we're ultimately going to step into those pathways and might throw them off balance. So there's four key elements that are heavily affected by humans in our planet that we really discuss in environmental science or environmental sustainability. So the biggest one is carbon. Okay, that's what we're always hearing about, is that the carbon and our carbon footprint, that is what is influencing global warming, or a better term would be climate change. But also there's a phosphorus cycle, a nitrogen cycle, and a sulfur cycle. So these nutrients are recycled and they're continually reused through biogeochemical cycles. Different nutrients are being recycled at different rates. Some processes occur very rapidly. So when we talk about photosynthesis in plants and respiration in eukaryotes or in plants and animals, you're going to see that those are very quick processes. But when you look at other processes like coal formation, that's going to take hundreds of millions of years. Making fossil fuels, that is going to take a very long time, and that's why whenever you hear about gasoline, they say that we're going to run out of that petroleum eventually. But just think about the difference in how fast these things occur. So the most notable cycle at the moment, like I said, is the carbon cycle because of the discussion of climate change. So with the carbon cycle, it starts with the reservoir of carbon that is in the air, that's in the form of CO2 or carbon dioxide. Through photosynthesis, carbon dioxide molecules become organic molecules, meaning that now we have something that has both carbon and hydrogen in them. So CO2 or carbon dioxide is inorganic because there's no hydrogen in it. Yes, there is carbon, but we need carbon and hydrogen in them. So we're going to turn that CO2, we're going to add hydrogen to that carbon and that oxygen that we get from our CO2, and we are going to make organic matter. We're going to make organic molecules out of them. Now, the big thing is organic molecules, all right, they store energy, and that's why they're so important to us. So plants and animals release carbon into the air, or carbon is deposited in soil as detritus, or meaning dead organisms. So when we talk about detritus, typically you're going to hear people talk about leaf litter. All right, so don't just think that when we talk about dead organisms, we're just talking about dead animals. We're also talking about dead plants. So leaf litter would be dead plants, and then you have carrion, which is going to be our dead animals. So carbon can also be transferred in a number of other ways: diffusion, exchange between the air and oceans, combustion of fossil fuels release CO2 into the air, as well as carbon monoxide. So this is a big one. This is why you hear about how we have to burn less fossil fuels and we have to use less coal in order to decrease our carbon footprint, in order to decrease the influence that us pumping this excess carbon dioxide into the air is going to have on the earth. Also, fossilization of dead plants and animals into coal. Limestone, which is going to be trapped in carbon. We'll talk about that more. Will release carbon when weathering is going to occur. So limestone is a sedimentary rock, and once that rock is exposed to weather, it is undergoes weathering, we're going to see that carbon is going to be released. But it is trapped for a period of time in which that limestone is just sedimentary rock and is not releasing that carbon back into the carbon cycle. But it is part of the carbon cycle. So a single carbon atom is said to cycle through the system about every 5 or 6 years. That's on average. You see that when we talk about photosynthesis, that's going to release that carbon back into the cycle very quickly. But when you talk about limestone and it trapping carbon into it for an extended period of time, that's going to take a lot longer. That could take millions of years. That's going to take a lot longer than photosynthesis. So on average, we like to just say that a single carbon atom is going to make its way through this whole cycle in 5 or 6 years, but that's really just on average. If we were to follow two different carbon atoms, maybe one's released or makes its way through that cycle very quickly, and then another one takes millions of years. So just as looking at a specific figure, we see that if we hone in on organisms, okay, they're going to use cellular respiration in order to make energy, use energy, and decomposers are also going to be organisms. So animals, plants, decomposers, all of these things are going to take organic matter, turn it into cellular energy, or ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, and we're going to use that energy. And in using that energy, we're going to create CO2. We exhale CO2, and that's how it makes its way back into the atmosphere. We also bring it back in through photosynthesis. So photosynthesis, or plants are going to use that CO2 in order to make more organic matter. But we also see that, hey, we have this carbon in the fossil fuels, and we're going to burn those fossil fuels, and we're going to put that into the atmosphere through combustion. Limestone is going to trap it for a period of time, but then it's going to release it when it is weathered. We have carbon in the detritus, in the leaf litter, in the decaying organisms. We also have it in coal, oil, gas, petroleum, tar sands. All of these things are going to have it, and we're going to be able to burn these, and it's going to go back into the atmosphere. Volcanoes are going to release CO2. CO2 is going to have a transfer or an exchange with the ocean surface, where sometimes it goes to the surface and then the surface exchanges it back with the atmosphere, and then other times it goes down deep into the deep ocean, and it's going to create these deposits, and then that can trap the CO2 for millions of years, for a very extended period of time, and it can create limestone. And then over long periods of time, with tectonic plates pushing up that land mass, we're going to see that maybe it's a much higher up. Eventually, it's not underwater anymore, and then weathering can occur, and it can release it. So there's this constant back and forth between organisms and the atmosphere, and fossil fuels and the atmosphere, and limestone in the atmosphere. So it's going back and forth. It's cycling its way through the Earth, or through our environment. So human impact on the carbon cycle. Like I said, we are always talking about our impact on the carbon cycle. What are we doing wrong in order to see this major impact of climate change? So we greatly influence the carbon cycle. We're diverting or removing approximately 40% of the photosynthetic productivity of land plants, because we are cutting down forests, cutting down trees, ultimately creating less and less plants that are going to be able to take carbon dioxide from the environment and then release oxygen back into it. So we are cutting off this balance that we previously had. We're also burning a massive amount of fossil fuels, which is going to increase the CO2 more than it would typically be there, and we're doing that by 35% over the pre-industrial level. So previously to us burning all these fossil fuels, okay, we had 35% less atmospheric CO2. So between the 40% decrease in us pulling that CO2 out, and then the 35% increase of us putting it in, now we see this drastic change in the carbon cycle, where suddenly there's more and more CO2 in the atmosphere and less being pulled out of the atmosphere. So deforestation and soil degradation are going to release significant amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere, because keep in mind, if we are cutting down the trees, not only are we removing the plants that are going to use photosynthesis to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and put oxygen into the atmosphere, but we're also making it so that the progression of leaf litter and adding nutrients back to the soil is going to be cut off. Now we're using these soils for crops, and or we're using this soil to build on, and suddenly you don't have anything putting the nutrients back into the soil, where previously if you had this forest, the trees are going to shed their leaves in the fall, and we're going to have those leaves start to decay, start to decompose, and they're going to add nutrients back to the soil, and then it's going to start all over again. But when we remove those trees, now nothing's adding nutrients to soil. We're just pulling nutrients out, as we plant crops there. So that's going to also influence the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. So recently, we see that now there's a big push to end deforestation and start a reforestation movement, planting more trees, stop removing trees by vast amounts. But we really are nowhere near what we need to be as far as trying to reverse the effect that we've had on our environment. Another one that we talk about is the phosphorus cycle. So mineral elements originate in the rock and the soil minerals. A shortage of phosphorus is a limiting factor. So when we talk about limiting factors, when we talked about ecology and the food web and the energy pyramid, okay, we see that different environments are going to have different aspects that are going to influence which organisms are going to be able to survive and how many can survive there. And whatever is going to really be that thing that is deciding the most, that's going to be our limiting factor. And phosphorus is a huge limiting factor. If there is not enough phosphorus, then we're going to see that plants are going to fight with each other over that phosphorus. We're going to see that there's not going to be enough phosphorus for all these plants to live on top of each other, and there's going to be less and less plants. So what really influences how many plants can be in an environment is how much phosphorus is available to these plants in order for them to survive, because they need the phosphorus. So excess phosphorus can stimulate algae growth. So we're going to look at a figure that is going to show us that, hey, as we're interfering with the phosphorus cycle, that's going to then cause issues with algae growth in bodies of water. The Hudson River in the past has had these issues with algae bloom because of our influence on the phosphorus cycle. So about a year ago, you heard about algae blooms, but even in the early 2000s, there were issues with algae blooms. So it's not something that just happens once, but it's something that is reoccurring, can happen every so many years, and it could be a major issue to our ecosystem. As rocks break down, phosphorus is going to be released, but as you know, we are constantly ruining this cycle, and we are using more phosphate or phosphorus than is being put back into the soil. So organic phosphate it's incorporated into organic compounds by plants from soil or water. The cycles through the food web, broken down by cellular respiration or decomposers. So here you see that typically you want in the cycle, you're going to have animals taking in, or heterotrophs, we're going to see they're going to be taking in phosphate or phosphorus, and it's going to be excreted as phosphate, and then it's going to go back into the soil, and it might help with algae, and then you're going to see that it's going to make its way back into the plants, and then the heterotrophs or the animals are going to eat those plants, and it's going to cycle through. But what we see now is we know as intelligent humans, we know that, hey, we need this phosphorus in order for our plants to do well. So what we're going to do is we're going to harvest this phosphorus from mining phosphate rocks, and we're going to use it as fertilizer. And we're going to add this phosphorus, to the agriculture to our crops, to our lawns, in order to bump up the productivity and how well those plants do. But now we're adding more and more. So now you see from here, we're adding more and more to the cycle than just the animals alone. And you're creating this issue where you're adding too much. It's not making its way back out into the plants fast enough. So this cycle is not connected to the atmosphere like the carbon cycle is, all right, which limits its biosphere recycling. Okay, there's not as many routes for it to cycle through. Now, the human impact on the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is mined and made into fertilizers. We are constantly making sure that we have fertilizers that are heavy in phosphorus and nitrogen because that's what plants need. Okay, animal feeds, detergents, more. We're taking more phosphorus from the earth than putting it back in necessarily, or when we're putting it back in, it's going to the wrong area. So fertilizers create the most serious intrusions because we're constantly pulling the phosphorus out of the earth and putting it in specific locations, and we're not letting the natural progression happen. Increased phosphorus in the soil can stimulate production, which is desirable for agriculture, but human use of fertilizer has tripled the amount reaching the oceans, which accelerates the cycle, leads to more phosphorus in the ocean without it being replaced into the soil quick enough. So, it accelerates the process of it going into the ocean, but it doesn't accelerate the process of it coming out to the ocean, making its way back to the plants and back to the heterotrophs. And you see that now we're interfering with the cycle by pulling it from here, putting it here, but it's ending up here and it's not making its way back fast enough. So excess phosphorus in the water has negative effects on the ecosystem. Obviously, yes, it's helping us create more crops. It's keeping us alive, but it is then going to the bodies of water and it is ruining those ecosystems because there's going to be an overgrowth of algae. And as much as you may want algae, you don't want too much algae. And we can ultimately have fish die and influence the ecosystems in that way and interfere with the food web. Excess nutrients in a specific location is known as eutrophication, often used as a negative term because obviously it can create these algae blooms and it can kill fish. So the nitrogen cycle, this is the trickiest cycle to really talk about because it has this strange route to it where we're not just taking in nitrogen and putting it back in. Now we need specific bacteria in order to help us with the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen is in high demand by aquatic and land plants. And if you ever hear about people that grow things hydroponically, they are always talking about how they need to put plenty of nitrogen into their plants. So we know that we need phosphorus and we know that we need nitrogen, so we are constantly putting them into our crops. And if you ever talk to anyone that grows hydroponically, they're always putting in things like bat guano, which is bat feces. They're putting that in because it's high in nitrogen, so they're putting that in to their marijuana or whatever they're growing, and that's going to help them grow. So we are constantly taking those fertilizers that are nitrogen and our phosphorus, and we are putting them into the soil. This cycle is very unique and seemingly more complex to understand because we have bacteria in the soil, water, and sediments that perform many steps of the cycle. So we need these bacteria in order to keep the cycle going. So air is the main reservoir of nitrogen, as you know. Nitrogen gas is in the air. So when we say air, everyone always thinks about oxygen because that's what we're pulling out of the air. But air is not just oxygen, right? It's a number of gases, and the big ones are nitrogen and oxygen as well, but it's not just pure oxygen. So there's a lot of nitrogen gas in the air. So this is known as non-reactive nitrogen because most organisms cannot use it. All right, we need nitrogen, but we're not pulling it from the air. We're not breathing it in, and then our lungs are sending it to our circulatory system for it to go through the body like we do with oxygen. All right, instead, most organisms cannot use the very abundant non-reactive nitrogen gas. So nitrogen is quite limited to the organisms of most ecosystems. Reactive nitrogen is the term used for the form of nitrogen that can be used by organisms in chemical reactions. So we we need the reactive nitrogen in order for us to have nitrogen available to our bodies. So we have land plants, which are non-nitrogen fixing producers. They take up reactive nitrogen in the form of ammonium or nitrate ions, and they incorporate them into proteins and nucleic acids. Remember, we talked about DNA and we talked about protein synthesis. Well, we need nitrogen in order to make proteins, in order to make our amino acids. So nitrogen is in amino acids. And those are the building blocks of protein. So we need those in order to build our proteins. Now, soil bacteria, which we call nitrifying bacteria because it's going to oxidize ammonium to nitrate to obtain energy, and the nitrate is available for plant uptake. So now this soil bacteria is going to make nitrogen available to the plants. All right. The bacteria and cyanobacteria can use non-reactive nitrogen, the nitrogen from the atmosphere that we can't use, through biological nitrogen fixation. So this is all called nitrogen fixation, fixing nitrogen, taking nitrogen and putting it into the organisms in the environment. So the organisms, we can't use this nitrogen. All right, we need these bacteria to make it available to us. So you have nitrogen fixing microbes, the microbes that are going to fix microbes that they're not in just any plants. They're actually specifically in legumes, and you're going to see them in legume root nodules. So any legume is going to have these root nodules in their, these little nodules or outpouchings in their roots where the bacteria live. And a lot of times they're mistaken as vegetables. Okay, their legumes are specific to themselves. They are peas, our chickpeas. Big ones in our lawns that are going to help fix nitrogen for our lawns is going to be clovers. You have lentils and soybeans. Okay, the legume provides a home and food for the bacteria, and the bacteria are then going to fix nitrogen for that plant. So there's this give and take. All right, that give and take, we're going to talk more about this later in the course, but this is called symbiosis, where these two things live very closely together and kind of are inseparable, or they're gonna live so close together they influence each other on a moment to moment basis. So the legume receives a source of nitrogen in return. That's the symbiotic relationship or symbiosis. And nitrogen enters the food web through the legume. So we need legumes. We need peas, lentils, soybeans. We need clovers in order for us to have nitrogen available to plants and to animals. So 3 other processes that fix nitrogen, just to be aware of. You're going to have atmospheric nitrogen fixation, which is in the form of lightning, which we don't see so much. Industrial fixation in fertilizer manufacturing, and combustion of fossil fuels oxidizes nitrogen. So this we see once again. Combustion of fossil fuels, burning fossil fuels is influencing another cycle, not just the carbon cycle, but now the nitrogen cycle. Industrial fixation and fossil fuels release nitrogen oxides, which are converted into nitric acid, and this nitric acid is going to create acid rain. So now we have another issue where we have acid rain coming down, killing wildlife, influencing our watershed, killing fish. And then you have denitrification, which is a microbial process in oxygen-poor soils and sediments. In these soils, microbes use nitrates as a substitute for oxygen. And the nitrogen is reduced, meaning it gains electron. It's going to be reduced to nitrogen gas and is going to be released into the atmosphere. Also occurs in sewage treatment systems or sewage treatment plants to remove nitrogen from wastewater. So this shows you just an example where we have our soil bacteria. Okay, we have our nitrogen fixing producers, our legumes, and our cyanobacteria, and we see that we have a ton of it in the air. Okay, but we can't use it. We need our soil bacteria to create this ammonium compounds, and we need to make sure that it is able to become available for the plants, and then through the plants is going to be available to the animals, and it's going to make its way through. But also things that are going to influence it are lightning as well as combustion of fossil fuels. So as much as we see that all these things are going to keep the cycle going, we suddenly see there's a we're decreasing that balance by adding more nitrogen to our crops. Okay, we're going to add more nitrogen to our crops, or maybe I should circle over here. There's our non-nitrogen fixing producers. Okay, and we're going to see that they are we're adding more to them, and they are making its way through the cycle faster than the nitrogen is necessarily being made naturally. So just something to keep in mind as we move forward and talk about how these cycles are influencing our climate change and our environment. So human impacts on the nitrogen cycle. Humans significantly affect the nitrogen cycle. You're going to see many crops, such as many crops are legumes that draw nitrogen from the air and increase the rate of nitrogen fixation on the land. Other crops are heavily fertilized with nitrogen, the ones that are non-leguminous, our corn, our wheat, our potatoes, the things that we all are constantly eating. I think we could all agree, unless maybe you're a vegetarian, you eat a lot of soy, but we could all agree a lot of us are really eating mainly corn, wheat, and potato products. Burning fossil fuels fixes nitrogen from the air, and we are more than doubling the rate of nitrogen moving from the air to the land. So if there was a balance before, which there was once upon a time, now we have doubled the rate of it going from the air to the land, but we have not changed the rate that's going from the land to the air. So serious consequences of adding these fertilizers. Remember, we were talking about we use these fertilizers that are heavy in phosphorus and heavy in nitrogen. You're going to have nitric acid, going to destroy lakes, ponds, forests, as well as sulfuric acid, which damages the lakes and the forests. You have atmospheric nitrogen adds to ozone pollution, climate change, and stratospheric ozone depletion, which ozone depletion is down from what it once was back in the 80s. Okay, but we're still influencing that. It could still be a lot better. In many areas, organisms cannot use excess nitrogen. It is released into the soil, washes into the water. It leads to eutrophication of estuaries and coastal ocean areas. So we see that there's now too much nitrogen in these areas. And nitrogen cascade, the ecological effects and problems as reactive nitrogen moves through the environment. So we see that, hey, now it's a reoccurring problem, all right, that's exponentially worse and worse. That's that nitrogen cascade as we affect our environment. While some plants prosper in soil that is high in nitrogen, others suffer, which has a negative effect, detrimental effect on the ecosystem that experiences eutrophication. Now, the sulfur cycle. Okay, sulfur is a part of proteins, hormones, and vitamins. It's often linked with oxygen, such as sulfate, which is SO4. Most sulfur is in rocks, minerals, ocean sediments. We're going to see sulfur enters the air or soil by weathering of rocks. This is a big one. Also, volcanic activity, fossil fuel burning, and processing of metal. So you see again, hey, it's a reoccurring theme, burning of fossil fuels, combustion. That's going to influence another cycle. Plants and microbes take up soil sulfate. In air, sulfur dioxide forms acid rain. So another one. Now, not only is it the nitric acid, but you also have this sulfur dioxide, which is also making acid rain. So now we have two different things that are creating this acid rain and having a detrimental effect to our watershed, to our lakes and our streams and our rivers. Sulfur enters water bodies from the air or rock weathering and can be a serious pollutant. So this shows you just another example of how it is going to cycle through and how our factories are adding to the atmospheric sulfur, and it is coming down into our water, and when too much of it is going to come down, it's going to throw off the entire balance of the cycle. So acid rain and water pollution are major effects. Sulfur is not usually added to soil as fertilizer, but we do see that sulfur aerosols, small particles or droplets of sulfur are they're going to temporarily cool the atmosphere, but they can cause other problems when they fall to the earth. So another way that we are influencing our environment by throwing off the balance of a cycle. Not really discussed as much, not as big of an influence as, say, the carbon cycle, how we're adding so much carbon to our atmosphere, but still something to think about. So comparing some cycles, carbon, that's of course the main one that we're going to talk about. Directly taken in by plants, it is rarely a limiting factor in plant growth. Okay, plants have plenty of carbon around, but the carbon cycle is really the one that we mainly talk about when we talk about environmental sustainability because of the influence, the negative impact that we're having on the environment with adding so much carbon to it. So nitrogen, phosphorus are limiting factors. That's where we are adding a lot of it to the soil, and it's not working its way through its natural progression through their cycles. Humans have sped up all four cycles: acid rain, greenhouse gases, eutrophication. All these things are because of us. Other cycles exist for other elements, such as water, which we haven't talked about, but all go on simultaneously and all come together in tissues of living things. So they are not completely separate. They are all going on at the same time, but we like to separate them and discuss them separately. And this is just a reminder where we talk about the food web. So remember, when we're talking about the food web, we're talking about organic matter. So in our producers, they need organic matter in order to use for their own energy, but also then we're going to have decomposers use them for energy, and we're also going to have our primary consumers use them for energy, and then the primary consumers are going to send the energy to the secondary consumers and to the third order consumers, or the tertiary consumers, and then to the quaternary consumers if we have them. But in all of this, we need inorganic nutrients. So as much as we talk about organic matter, we're talking about also our CO2, our nitrogen, our phosphorus, our iron, our calcium, our potassium. All these things are inorganic nutrients that we need in order to keep producers and consumers alive, and they're going to influence if we're able to make organic matter. So keep these things in mind.